Yes. The fire curtain. A former FBI analyst opens a file he helped create, but was forbidden to discuss for nearly 5 decades. Inside are surveillance reports, secret recordings, and proof that Elvis Presley was not watched for his fame or scandals, but for what he discovered about powerful people who wanted him silenced. What did Elvis know that made him dangerous? The file never meant to be opened. The house was too quiet for a man who had spent 40 years listening to secrets. Thomas Brennan sat in his study on a cold Tuesday morning, staring at the envelope that had arrived without ceremony. No phone call, no warning, just a plain brown package with a government seal and a single word stamped in faded ink. Approved. He was 73 now. His hands shook as he tore the edge of the paper. Inside was a letter confirming what he had requested 11 times over 30 years. Final clearance. Permission to access the file he had helped create but was never allowed to discuss. The file that had haunted him since 1967. The Elvis Presley file. Most people thought they knew everything about Elvis. The music, the movies, the mansion, the tragic ending. But they did not know this. They did not know that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had kept a file on him that went far beyond the usual celebrity monitoring. They did not know that Elvis had not been watched because of his fame, or his money, or even the controversies that surrounded his hips and his voice. He had been watched because of what he knew. Thomas rose slowly and walked to the locked cabinet in the corner of his study. The key was hidden in a cigar box he had not touched in years. His fingers fumbled with the small brass lock. Inside, beneath stacks of forgotten reports and black and white photographs, was a thick folder wrapped in cloth. It smelled like dust and old ink. He carried it to his desk and sat down. The folder was heavier than he remembered, or maybe he was just older. It had stuck for decades. He had tried to forget. He had retired. He had moved away. He had told himself that the past was sealed and buried, and that no one would ever ask questions again. But the file had never left him. It whispered in his sleep. It surfaced in his dreams. It reminded him that some truths do not fade just because you stop speaking them. Thomas untied the string around the folder. His chest felt tight. The room seemed to shrink. He opened the cover. The first page was a surveillance report dated March 8, 1967. Location, Memphis, Tennessee. Subject, Elvis Aaron Presley. Reason for observation, contact with persons of interest related to ongoing federal investigation. But it was the handwritten note in the margin that made Thomas stop breathing. It was his own handwriting, scrawled in blue ink, barely legible after all these years. He saw them. He knows. Thomas closed his eyes. The memory came rushing back like a wave. The cold basement office. The reel-to-reel tapes, the voices on the recordings that should never have been captured, and Elvis standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, asking the wrong questions. They had told Thomas to bury it. They had told him that national security depended on silence. They had told him that Elvis would be protected as long as he stayed quiet. But Elvis had not stayed quiet, and now, 58 years later, Thomas was the only one left who knew the truth. He turned the page, his hands trembled. Beneath the report was a photograph, black and white, grainy, taken from a distance. Elvis stood in a parking lot, talking to a man in a dark coat. The man's face was blurred, but Thomas recognized him instantly, because that man had passed on 3 days after the photograph was taken, and his death had never been explained. Thomas felt the old fear return, the kind that does not fade with age, the kind that lives in your bones. He was about to learn whether opening this file had been a mistake, or whether it was already too late. When the king crossed an invisible line, Thomas stared at the photograph until the edges blurred. Then he turned the page and let the file pull him backward through time. It was 1977. Elvis Presley was 42 years old and still the most famous man in America. But fame had become a prison. He lived behind the gates of Graceland, surrounded by people who called themselves friends but were really employees. He performed in Las Vegas and on tour, but his health was failing. His voice was still powerful, but his body was breaking down. The world saw a legend. The Bureau saw something else. It started with a phone call. Thomas had been a junior analyst then, assigned to a division that monitored domestic security threats. One afternoon in April, his supervisor dropped a thin folder on his desk and told him to read it carefully. Inside were transcripts of intercepted phone calls. Not from criminals, not from foreign agents, from Elvis Presley. The calls were strange, short, coded. Elvis spoke to people whose names did not appear in any public record. He asked questions about government operations. He mentioned locations that were not supposed to be known outside classified circles. He used phrases that suggested he had access to information he should not have. Thomas remembered the confusion he felt. Why would Elvis Presley know anything about federal operations? Why would he care? The answer came 2 weeks later. Elvis had begun meeting with a man named Jonathan Ward. Ward was a former intelligence officer who had left government service under unclear circumstances. He was brilliant, paranoid, and deeply connected to networks that operated in the shadows. He did not work for any agency anymore, but he still knew things, dangerous things. And he was talking to Elvis. The meetings happened quietly. A diner outside Memphis, a hotel room in Los Angeles, a private airfield in Texas. Ward would arrive alone. Elvis would arrive with one bodyguard. They would talk for hours. No one knew what they discussed, but the Bureau noticed. Thomas was assigned to build a profile. He studied Elvis's movements, his phone records, his travel patterns. What he found disturbed him. Elvis was not behaving like a celebrity. He was behaving like someone gathering information. He asked questions about missing persons. He requested files from local law enforcement. He hired private investigators to look into cases that had been closed for years. He made calls to journalists who specialized in government cover-ups. He even reached out to a former senator who had been forced to resign after exposing corruption in a federal agency. Elvis was investigating something, and he was doing it quietly. The Bureau held an internal meeting. Thomas sat in the back of the room and listened as senior agents debated what to do. Some argued that Elvis was harmless, a bored celebrity chasing conspiracy theories. Others were not so sure. They pointed out that Elvis had access to powerful people. He had money. He had influence. If he was digging into something sensitive, he could cause serious damage. One agent raised a question that silenced the room. What if Elvis already knows something we cannot let him prove? No one answered. The decision was made quietly. Elvis Presley would be monitored, not openly, not aggressively, just carefully. They would watch his meetings. They would track his communications. They would document his movements, and they would wait to see what he was really looking for. Thomas was assigned to the case. He did not want it. He did not understand it, but he followed orders. The surveillance began in May. Cameras, wiretaps, informants placed inside Elvis's circle. Everything was recorded. Everything was filed. Everything was kept secret. For weeks, nothing unusual happened. Elvis performed. He rested. He spent time at Graceland. He seemed like a man living a quiet, isolated life. But then, in late June, something changed. Elvis received a package. It was delivered by hand to Graceland. No return address, no sender, just a plain brown envelope. Elvis opened it alone in his bedroom. Whatever was inside, he did not show anyone. But the next day, he canceled all his scheduled appearances. He stopped taking calls. He locked himself away, and when he finally emerged, he looked afraid. Thomas remembered listening to the audio recording from that night. Elvis had called Jonathan Ward. His voice was shaking. He said 4 words that sent the entire investigation into overdrive. They lied about everything. Thomas did not know what Elvis had seen, but he knew one thing. The invisible line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The voices Elvis was listening to. Thomas turned another page in the file and found transcripts, dozens of them. Conversations recorded between June and August of 1977, each one marked with a red stamp, Priority Review. He remembered typing some of these himself. Late nights in a windowless office, headphones pressed against his ears, trying to make sense of words that seemed both ordinary and deeply wrong. Elvis was talking to people the Bureau did not expect. One conversation was with a retired Army colonel who had served in intelligence during the Cold War. Another was with a journalist who had written articles exposing corruption in defense contracts. There was a call to a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower cases. Another to a professor who studied government secrecy and classified programs. None of these people were criminals. None of them were threats. But together, they formed a pattern. Elvis was building a network. The recordings were strange. Elvis did not sound like the man the public knew. He was not joking. He was not casual. He was focused. He asked detailed questions. He took notes. He pushed for answers when people hesitated. In one conversation, he asked the colonel about military operations that had never been officially acknowledged. In another, he asked the journalist about missing documents related to a federal investigation that had been closed without explanation. He asked the lawyer what legal protections existed for someone who wanted to expose a government secret. And in every conversation, he mentioned protection. He wanted to know how to stay safe. He wanted to know who he could trust. He wanted to know what would happen if he went public, with information that powerful people wanted buried. Thomas had listened to those recordings with growing unease. At first, he thought Elvis was paranoid. Fame did that to people. Isolation made them suspicious. Maybe Elvis had spent too much time alone, surrounded by yes men and conspiracy theories. But then the tone of the conversations changed. In mid-July, Elvis called Jonathan Ward again. This time, his voice was calm. Too calm. He spoke like a man who had made a decision. He told Ward that he had received proof. He did not say what kind of proof or where it came from, but he said it was real. He said it connected people in positions of power to events that had been officially denied. He said that if the information became public, it would destroy careers and reputations. Ward told him to be careful. Ward told him that people had disappeared for knowing less. Elvis said he was already being followed. Thomas stopped the tape and rewound it. He listened again. Elvis said he had noticed the same car parked outside Graceland for 3 days. He said his phone calls sounded strange, like someone was listening. He said people close to him had been approached and asked questions about what he was doing. Elvis knew he was being watched, and he knew it was not because of his fame. The Bureau held another meeting. This time, the room was tense. Agents who had dismissed Elvis as a paranoid celebrity were now silent, because the surveillance reports confirmed what Elvis had said. There were other people watching him, not just the FBI. Unmarked vehicles had been spotted near Graceland. Phone lines had been tapped by unknown parties. People in Elvis's circle had been contacted by individuals who claimed to represent private security firms, but had no traceable credentials. Someone else was interested in Elvis, and they were not being subtle. Thomas remembered the moment everything shifted. An agent stood up and asked the question no one wanted to answer. What if Elvis is not imagining this? What if he actually found something? The room went quiet. They pulled the recordings again. They reviewed the transcripts. They analyzed every name Elvis had contacted. And slowly, a picture emerged. Elvis was not chasing random conspiracy theories. He was investigating something specific. Something that involved government operations, missing records, and people who had been silenced. And the more the Bureau dug, the more they realized that Elvis's questions were leading him toward classified territory, toward operations that had been buried, toward decisions that had been made in secret, toward truths that were never supposed to surface. The final report from that meeting was 3 sentences long. Thomas had typed it himself. The subject demonstrates knowledge of sensitive material. Source of information unknown. Recommend immediate escalation. They had underestimated him. They had thought he was just a singer asking dangerous questions. But Elvis was not asking questions anymore. He was finding answers. And that made him the most dangerous man in America. The silent agreement that changed everything. Thomas found the memo buried halfway through the file. It was dated August 3, 1977, marked confidential, signed by a deputy director whose name had been redacted. It outlined an agreement that had never been made public. Elvis Presley would cooperate with the Bureau, but not as an informant, not as a witness, as something else entirely. He would listen. The arrangement was simple. Elvis moved in circles that included politicians, entertainers, businessmen, and people connected to powerful networks. He attended private parties. He stayed in expensive hotels. He met people who spoke freely around him because they assumed a celebrity would not care about their secrets. The Bureau wanted access to those spaces, and Elvis, knowingly or not, could provide it. Thomas remembered how the plan had been presented. It was not surveillance. It was not exploitation. It was mutual protection. Elvis had stumbled onto something dangerous. The Bureau could help him stay safe. In return, he would share what he heard. Nothing formal, nothing recorded, just quiet conversations that allowed the Bureau to track movements and connections they could not reach through traditional methods. Elvis agreed. But he set conditions. He would not testify. He would not sign anything. He would not be named in any investigation. And if his cooperation ever became public, the agreement would end immediately. The Bureau accepted. For weeks it worked. Elvis attended events. He spoke to people. He reported back through Jonathan Ward, who acted as a go-between. The information was vague but useful. Names, locations, hints about meetings and financial deals that seemed questionable. But something changed in Elvis. Thomas saw it in the surveillance reports. Elvis stopped smiling in public. He canceled performances without explanation. He spent more time alone. He stopped trusting the people around him. He fired bodyguards. He questioned friends. He became suspicious of everyone. The agreement that was supposed to protect him was destroying him. One night in mid-August, Elvis called Ward. The recording was painful to listen to. Elvis sounded exhausted. He said he could not tell what was real anymore. He said he did not know who was watching him or why. He said he felt trapped. Ward tried to reassure him, but Elvis was not listening. He said something that made Thomas's blood run cold. "I think they are not protecting me. I think they are controlling me." The Bureau denied it. They insisted the agreement was voluntary. They said Elvis could walk away anytime. But Thomas knew the truth. Once someone knows too much, walking away is not an option. Elvis tried anyway. In late August, he stopped communicating with Ward. He stopped attending events. He withdrew completely. He stayed at Graceland and refused to leave. The Bureau panicked. They had lost their access. Worse, they had lost control of someone who knew things that could not be unsaid. An internal order was issued. Monitoring would continue. But the focus had changed. They were no longer watching Elvis to protect him. They were watching him to see what he would do next. Thomas sat in the meeting where the decision was made. He remembered the faces around the table. Cold, calculating, afraid. One agent said it plainly. "If he talks, we cannot stop the fallout. We need to know before he makes that choice." Thomas had wanted to object. He wanted to say that Elvis was not a threat, that he was just a man who had been used and discarded, that he deserved to be left alone. But he said nothing, because by then, he understood the truth. The agreement had never been about cooperation. It had been about containment. And now, Elvis Presley was a man the government could not afford to trust. When the watching turned into worry. Thomas pulled out a stack of reports from the final weeks. They were different from the earlier ones. The language had changed. The tone had shifted. Something had gone wrong, and everyone had seen it coming. By the end of August 1977, Elvis was barely recognizable. The surveillance photos showed a man who looked older than his 42 years. His face was swollen. His movements were slow. He walked with difficulty. He rarely left Graceland. When he did, he was surrounded by people who seemed more like handlers than friends. The recordings from inside the estate were disturbing. Elvis spoke less. He spent hours alone in his bedroom. He took medications that worried even the people closest to him. His speech was sometimes slurred. His thoughts seemed scattered. He talked about feeling watched, followed, and trapped. The Bureau had protocols for situations like this. When a subject showed signs of instability, monitoring was supposed to be reviewed. Decisions were supposed to be reassessed. Questions were supposed to be asked. But no one stopped watching Elvis. Instead, the reports became more detailed, more invasive, more concerned. One report from late August described Elvis pacing his bedroom at 3 in the morning, talking to himself. Another noted that he had stopped eating regular meals. Another mentioned that his physician had expressed private concerns about his health, but had been dismissed by people in Elvis's inner circle. Thomas remembered reading those reports and feeling sick. This was not intelligence gathering anymore. This was watching a man fall apart. And no one was helping him. There were warnings, clear ones. A medical consultant reviewed the surveillance data and wrote a memo stating that Elvis was showing signs of severe physical and psychological distress. The consultant recommended immediate intervention. The memo was filed and ignored. An agent suggested scaling back the operation. He argued that Elvis was no longer a viable source of information, and that continued monitoring served no purpose. His suggestion was rejected. Another agent raised ethical concerns. He said that watching someone deteriorate without offering help violated basic human decency. He was told that the operation had been authorized at the highest levels, and that his job was to follow orders, not question them. Thomas had been one of the silent ones. He had seen the warnings. He had read the reports. He had listened to the recordings of a man who was clearly suffering, and he had done nothing. He told himself that it was not his decision to make, that he was just an analyst, that he had no authority to stop what was happening. But those excuses felt hollow, even then. By mid-August, the tone of the internal memos had changed. Agents were no longer debating whether Elvis was a threat. They were debating whether he would survive. One report stated plainly that Elvis's physical condition was critical. Another noted that his behavior had become erratic and unpredictable. Another warned that people close to him were enabling his decline rather than stopping it. But the most chilling report came on August 14th. It was written by a senior agent who had reviewed all the surveillance data. He concluded that Elvis Presley was no longer in control of his own life. He was isolated, manipulated, and medicated into compliance, and the people around him were either too afraid or too invested to intervene. The report ended with a single line that Thomas had never forgotten. The subject is at significant risk. Outcome uncertain. 2 days later, Elvis performed his final concert in Indianapolis. The footage showed a man who could barely stand. He forgot the lyrics. He stumbled on stage. His voice cracked. The audience cheered anyway, but backstage, people were frightened. Elvis returned to Graceland and did not leave again. The surveillance continued. Cameras watched the gates. Phone lines were monitored. Reports were filed daily. But the focus had shifted once more. They were no longer watching to see what Elvis would do. They were watching to see what would happen to him. Thomas remembered the final week. The recordings were sparse. Elvis stayed in his room. He spoke to almost no one. The few conversations that were captured were brief and incoherent. He sounded tired, defeated, lost. On August 15th, an agent filed a report noting that Elvis had not been seen outside his bedroom in over 24 hours. The report recommended a welfare check. It was never acted upon. On August 16th, the surveillance went silent. No calls, no movement, no sound. And then, at 2:39 in the afternoon, the news broke. Elvis Presley was dead. Thomas sat in his office and stared at the notification. Around him, agents scrambled. Phones rang. Orders were issued. Files were pulled. Evidence was secured. But Thomas did not move because he knew the truth. They had watched Elvis die, and they had done nothing to stop it. The file was sealed forever. Thomas stood at the window of his office on August 16, 1977, watching the city below move as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Elvis Presley was dead. The official cause would be listed as cardiac arrhythmia, heart failure. The media would talk about his weight, his medications, his lifestyle. They would say he had been sick for years. They would say it was tragic, but not unexpected. No one would ask the questions that mattered. Within an hour of the announcement, Thomas's phone rang. He was ordered to report to a secure conference room on the 3rd floor. When he arrived, the room was already full. Senior agents, legal advisors, officials whose names he did not recognize, but whose presence meant the situation had escalated far beyond the bureau. The atmosphere was tense. No one spoke unless necessary. Files were spread across the table. Transcripts, surveillance logs, medical reports, everything they had collected on Elvis over the past 4 months. And in the center of the table was the sealed envelope Elvis had received in June, the one that had changed everything. Thomas had never seen what was inside. No one in the room had. It had been classified above their clearance level, but they all knew it was the reason they were there. A deputy director entered the room and closed the door behind him. He did not sit down. He stood at the head of the table and spoke in a voice that allowed no interruption. The file on Elvis Presley would be sealed immediately. All surveillance would be terminated. All records would be classified. All personnel involved in the operation would sign non-disclosure agreements. No one would discuss what had been done. No one would question what had happened. An agent raised his hand. He asked the question everyone was thinking. What about the truth? The deputy director stared at him for a long moment. Then he said something Thomas would never forget. The truth does not matter if no one is ready to hear it. He explained that Elvis had been monitored because he had gained access to information that threatened national security. Not through espionage, not through criminal activity, but through coincidence and curiosity and connections that led him to places he was never supposed to reach. Elvis had learned about covert operations that had been conducted without congressional oversight. He had discovered financial arrangements between government officials and private corporations that violated federal law. He had uncovered evidence of surveillance programs that targeted American citizens without warrants or legal justification. And he had been preparing to go public. The envelope he received in June had contained documents, proof, names, dates, transactions. Everything he needed to expose a network of corruption and abuse that reached into the highest levels of government. But Elvis had hesitated. He had been afraid. He had known that speaking out would destroy his life. So he waited. He had sought advice. He had tried to find a way to tell the truth without becoming a target, and while he waited, his health collapsed. The deputy director said that releasing the file would cause panic. It would destabilize public trust in institutions that were already fragile. It would lead to investigations that could not be controlled. It would expose people who still held power and who would fight to protect themselves. So the decision was made, the file would be sealed, the truth would be buried, and Elvis Presley would be remembered as a troubled entertainer who passed on too young, not as a man who had tried to expose the powerful and paid for it with his life. Thomas wanted to object. He wanted to stand up and say that this was wrong, that Elvis deserved better, that the truth mattered more than convenience or control. But he stayed silent because he was afraid. Afraid of losing his job, afraid of being labeled disloyal, afraid of what would happen if he refused to cooperate. So he signed the agreement, he handed over his files. He promised never to speak about what he had seen or heard. And he left the room, knowing that he had chosen silence over justice. The file was sealed on August 18th. All physical records were transferred to a classified archive. All personnel were reassigned. The operation was erased from official history. But the truth did not die with Elvis. It lived in the memories of everyone who had been part of the operation. It lived in the documents that had been hidden but not destroyed. It lived in the questions that were never asked and the answers that were never given. And it lived in Thomas. For 58 years, he carried the weight of what he had done. He told himself that he had followed orders, that he had been powerless to change anything, that his silence had protected something larger than himself, but he knew those were lies. He had been given a choice, and he had chosen wrong. Now, sitting in his study with the file open in front of him, Thomas understood that the time for silence was over. He was 73 years old. Most of the people involved in the operation were dead. The institutions they had protected had changed. The secrets they had buried were no longer as dangerous as they had once seemed, and Elvis deserved to be remembered as more than a tragic legend. He deserved to be remembered as a man who had seen the truth and tried to speak it. A man who had been used by people who claimed to protect him. A man who had passed away alone while those who watched him did nothing.